COVID calls, a daily welcome to episode 433 of the COVID calls, a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Adia Benton. I am a cultural anthropologist of public health and medicine in post-conflict and development settings, working at Northwestern University at Evanston, Illinois, but I'm coming to you live from, I think it's still snowing, maybe not, in Chicago, Illinois. Today, I talk with anthropologist Thurka Sangaramoorthy. I'll tell you more about her in a minute. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays, but Scott tells me that he's rushing to finish 500, so you can probably catch it day or night. It is on the YouTube channel. You can hear it on COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for guests and future topics. As of today, February 25th, 2022, there are 430 million cases, which is nearly double the cases last year. Last time I hosted the show in October. 5.92 million deaths from COVID-19 have been recorded. So Scott has been reading obituaries and stories of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue in that vein now by talking about my good friend, the physician and anthropologist Paul Edward Farmer Jr., who died at the age of 62 on February 21st. Some days after the announcement of his death in Rwanda at age 62, it seemed that everybody loved Paul. I know that I did. He loved me back. And there's nothing special about either of those things because he actively sought love and gave it as freely. I often felt like he projected his own condition onto others, a way of manifesting their more desirable personal qualities. He'd often tell me, and people who know me know that I'm very grumpy, that I had cardiomegaly, which in Paul speak meant that I was big-hearted and kind and not afflicted with heart disease. So I first met Paul when I was an undergraduate in the late 90s, and he guest lectured in a small seminar run by two of his anthropologist friends, Pat Simons and Lucille Newman. We were assigned two of his books. I mean, he was still in his late 30s at the time, for a class, and I had not read either book, and he subtly called me out on it. We corresponded on email for years about human rights and health, liberation theology, and occasionally meeting at conferences or on Harvard's campus, where as I completed my PhD. He later invited me to spend my junior sabbatical in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, where he was chair. An astute critic of social, political, and economic inequalities and their impact on health, he understood a person's place in hierarchy. He lingered a bit longer with the driver, the janitor, the waitstaff, the cleaner. And as most will tell us, he loved his patients too. My WhatsApp conversations with him from before the pandemic were filled with pictures of him with former patients in Peru, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. He had once boasted about hosting a large dinner party for Freetown-based Ebola survivors at one of the most expensive hotels in the city, at a time when survivors were stigmatized and held at arm's length. The day before he died, he sent me what he called a sweet video that medical students at the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda had made for him. It was a photo montage with Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black as the soundtrack. I told him he was only one of those three things. Paul seemed to walk the walk and talk the talk, which is why so many of us were disappointed when earlier this month he signed a letter supporting the Harvard anthropologist John Komaroff, an alleged serial abuser and harasser. We knew from our personal experiences that some of our intellectual heroes not only have failed to practice what they preach, but that they also engaged in predatory behavior that was at odds with their public scholarship. But Paul was a keen observer of human nature, organizations, and the organizations that humans inhabit. So he knew that patron-client relations were crucial and exploitative within elite academia. But it typically seemed important to him that he not use the power and goodwill that he'd accrued with his celebrity status and his prestigious awards to harm others. That same week, he'd even co-written a letter, an op-ed in the Boston Globe, decrying racist treatment of his colleagues at the Brigham and Women's Hospital by white nationalists. To me, it made no sense and was inconsistent. His signing the Komaroff letter, as small an act as he perceived it to be, would have had a significant impact on whether students felt they could trust him or even trust the integrity of his life's work. How could he not have known? So obviously, I was disturbed and reached out to him. I was kind of surprised. At the time, he seemed to think he actually was safeguarding LGBTQ students from abuse in the field, as Komaroff claimed to have been doing when speaking to one student in a way that she found disturbing about the danger of her being raped during field work. I told him what I knew about the situation, which was mostly detailed accounts that I'd heard from others about decades of harassment by Komaroff and his wife, star academics in the department, and argued that signing such a letter did not align with the values that I knew he held dear. He immediately apologized to me. I told him that I was not the person he needed to apologize to. We repeated this back and forth over the next couple of days, and he was working these 14-hour days, balancing clinical teaching responsibilities in Rwanda with administrative responsibilities back in Boston. The weight of having been on the wrong side of this important issue was eating away at him. He wrote to me, "I just don't feel like I have the thick skin required for this, nor do I want thick skin." On the evening before the retraction by a majority of the signatories was published, he sent me a message saying he planned to retract his signature and apologize. He insisted on an apology and not simply a retraction. He didn't like the idea of backpedaling, but this was not the consensus view, it would seem, among the other signatories in the group. The letter was published as a retraction only. As we continued to talk over the course of these weeks, these interceding weeks, I sensed he was growing tired of the shit that he had put up with among the anthropologists. He relished his clinical work, his clinical teaching, and he had a sense of purpose in his role as chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. In the last week of his life, Jan Brunson, a colleague at the University of Hawaii who'd attended a webinar in which he was presenting, publicly questioned him on the letter. She asked him how he reconciled his social justice work with having signed that letter. First of all, he said, I want to say that I don't think I can reconcile that. I think it was an error. And so I agree with Dr. Brunson, and I think saying that feels insufficient. I said that as well. I wouldn't want to sound like I was defending myself by saying that the topic at hand was about graduate student advising and a request for transparency in the process. I agree with the critique. I don't feel that those two things can reconcile. I think it's better just to say that I made a mistake and I'm very sorry about it. I told Paul that I saw his response. He wrote to me, I've only said one thing, and that is I am sorry and I was wrong. But I feel I've dishonored myself by signing a letter before knowing shit about any legal case. In fact, it was about protecting LGBTQ grad students, I thought. What an idiot. He continued, you already told me I was an idiot. And did I contest that? Or defend myself? I did not. For the record, I never called him an idiot. I inquired about his health because he looked tired during the video. So you'll rest? I asked him. He said, yes, when I get to Sierra Leone, he was in Rwanda when he said this, I will get more rest. I was skeptical because he would always qualify his promises to me about getting rest, about taking time off. But don't forget how much I love the clinical part, so that's kept me going XOXOX. Paul could be so fucking hard-headed. He lived enough for 3 extraordinary lifetimes, but he died doing what he loved. So, rest in peace. My guest today is Thurka Sangaramoorthy. Thurka is a cultural and medical anthropologist and public health researcher with over 20 years of experience conducting community-engaged ethnographic research, including rapid assessments among vulnerable populations in the United States, Africa, and Latin America, and Caribbean. Her work is broadly concerned with power and subjectivity in global economies of care, and she has worked in this intersection on diverse topics, which include global health, migration, HIV and STDs, environmental health disparities. She has done it all. So she is the author of 2 books, Rapid Ethnographic Assessments, A Practical Approach and Toolkit for Collaborative Community Research, which I use to conduct rapid ethnographic assessments. The second book, the first book actually, Treating AIDS, Politics of Difference, Paradox of Prevention, published by Rutgers in 2014. And she has 2 books in press. She's Positive, The Extraordinary Lives of Black Women Living with HIV, coming out this year, and Immigration and the Landscape of Care in Rural America, coming out next year, it looks like, with University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Sangaramoorthy is co-chair of the American Anthropological Association's Members Programmatic Advisory and Advocacy Committee. I think, is that called Impact? Yeah, I know. We have so many acronyms. And a board member of the Society for Medical Anthropology. She serves as the associate editor of Public Health Reports, editorial board member of the American Anthropologist, and the inaugural Social, Behavioral, and Qualitative Research section editor for PLOS Global Public Health. So submit your qualitative research to that journal. She's currently associate professor of anthropology at the University of Maryland. Welcome, Thurka. I am so happy to be hosting you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that beautiful sort of your thoughts. That was really important. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was, it's been a tough couple of weeks. Where are you my first question is always where are you? It's like, where are you? But where are you calling from? What's the pandemic situation there? Yeah.
So my situation's a little complicated. I'm actually calling from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I've been living here since, my goodness, December 2020. And I just got back this week from the US because I was evacuated in November with my family back to the US because of civil war. And we were just allowed to come back in February. So back here, Ethiopia in terms of COVID. I did pull up some numbers because I wasn't sure what the latest ones were. So right now, just hearing you talk about the numbers worldwide, it's just really, it's obscene. Those numbers are obscene. Staggering, yeah. Ethiopia right now, I know that it's spotty. Everyone knows it's spotty, but it's around 500,000 confirmed cases cumulatively, about 7,500 deaths cumulatively. The vaccine doses are, I don't know. Personally, I think it's strong. I mean, there could be a lot more. There's about 21 million vaccine doses that have been given out here. Obviously, much of this is really one dose, but that number is about 13%, which I think it's pretty good. But only 3% is really, are folks who are considered fully vaccinated. The numbers have come down a lot since the beginning of this year. It was pretty high, I think, the end of the year. But right now, I think it's about 2.5% positivity rate. Those numbers have come down, and the wave was really, it peaked at the end of last year, and it's been going down ever since. So,
so what's the what are there like mitigation strategies? Like, what's going on? What is it looking like? I mean, well, you just traveled this distance, where it's willy-nilly depending on where you go. Like,
I mean, I'll say some stuff that I don't know. I'll start with what has been going on here the last year. I think for me, my situation is really limited to Addis. So you need to take this with, a grain of salt in terms of me speaking on behalf, in terms of like what's going on in Ethiopia more broadly. It's really Addis when I'm talking about this, because our movements have been largely very limited to Addis because of the security situation for the past year. So I can only really talk about what's been going on here. Honestly, I think the government's response was fairly effective. There were containment measures. It included restrictions on social gatherings. There was a lot of people who were wearing face masks, to be honest with you. Physical distancing, that was really mandatory. I think a lot of folks were, as far as, I could see in terms of where I went and what I was seeing, I think there was a lot of compliance. I think coming back right now, February 2022, I think the restrictions are not as enforced. And I think people are kind of losing steam in terms of what's happening. There are far less people wearing masks. Generally, very few sort of containment measures. And I think, we can talk a little bit about this, and this a lot too well. I think the emergency response is really relied on primary public health infrastructure. It's very prevention based. It's really a health extension program and other kinds of approaches like community mobilization and public awareness, campaigns. I think, there's a tremendous amount of challenges here, just like in lots of other places around the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Limited resources, very weakening sort of health systems, issues in terms of supplies of ventilators and oxygen, overcrowding. And I think, the population lives outside of Addis, right? So it's not, most of what I've seen is really so focused on Addis. We really don't have a good understanding of what's happening in the rural areas. And I think most of COVID, I think Ethiopia has experienced civil conflict and then ultimately civil war. So that's another massive layer on top of what's been going on and what people have been able to do.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's sort of been it's sort of like, I've been wondering actually about places like Democratic Republic of Congo, which also had these sort of, ongoing rifts. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about what unrest will do when it's layered on top of all of these different kinds of health infrastructure issues and public health ideologies. So I was wondering if you could, I know this is maybe taking a little, because I kind of wanted to get into the rural stuff, but I think what I'll do is ask you your this thing, which I think is actually a really fun question on this show, which is like your most vivid memory about your your COVID year or COVID years. Are there any? Do you have one that stands out?
Oh my God. I think this is a hard question. I have multiple vivid memories. I think a lot of mine has been really sort of disconcerting. I became a solo parent at the very beginning of the pandemic. That was really difficult. When my spouse actually left and moved to Ethiopia for work, and because of what was happening, we couldn't sort of join. And so I basically essentially became a solo parent to 2 school-age kids, sort of hunkered down, virtual schooling with me doing work virtually, unable to get help, either from family, because I do have immunocompromised parents, and then also just worrying about what was happening, in terms of being an intergenerational caregiver, albeit sort of far away, and just this notion of being really isolated. That was hard. I think that was really difficult. And then moving, being given a very short time to actually move internationally during that time, and getting to a place that was really undergoing severe changes politically, economically, socially. I think that was really, that was really jarring. In some ways, I felt more protected here than I was in the US, if that makes any sense. I can talk a little bit more about that. I didn't think that we were having those sort of conversations about masking or, things like that. I felt much safer here. And then I think the other kind of major issue for me was actually losing people to COVID. That was really difficult. It really started, I think, not so much. I mean, I had family members who were affected, but they recovered. But one of the major sort of impacts that I had early on was that one of the women that I work with, I'm in the middle of an oral history project, or one of the books that I'm publishing right now. It's a compilation of oral histories of 12 women that I've known for pretty much about 10 years, about a decade, that I've been working with the same women for a long period of time. And she died at the very end of the year 2020 from COVID, which really impacted her asthma, and she landed in the hospital and then eventually passed away. So that was really difficult because I think, I'd been so worried about all of them and how things were going to sort of pan out for many of them in this situation. So that was really difficult. I actually sort of wrote about it in the book because I think, it was something that I really wanted to kind of process for myself and have other people sort of remember her legacy in a different way. And then, I had a couple of family members since then who have then passed away again. These are not, I don't know what they're labeled as. Are they COVID related deaths? Are they attributable to COVID? I have no idea. I don't know how they get designated, but these were people who had recovered from COVID, but never really did, I think. So,
Right. Yeah. No, I see that. Yeah, this is something that I kind of, that has me wondering, like, how we, and I think I might have put this in your when I was kind of sending you the is like, how are we supposed to, like, how are we counting? Like, one of the reasons, or the occasion upon which Thurka and I started working together was we were writing about enumeration and counting and like and the social uses of that, social and cultural and political uses of numbers, particularly as it comes to health. And so, as you're telling me about how we choose to count the deaths, how we choose to understand these dynamics, like, what actually counts, and even when I read those numbers, I was like, this is what they say the numbers are, but we understand them to be, we know that they're quite different. So what, like, I guess maybe the question that I would pose to you is like, how do we count? Like, or what counts? What like, what are the ways of counting that you think are important and under these circumstances?
I think there's a lot here that reminds me, somewhat of my work and all the things that we've talked about for, oh my God, over a decade now about counting, especially when it comes to HIV as well, right? I mean, I think there were definitions, there were case counts that have been reconfigured, that became, much more quote unquote revealing just because we started counting differently or thinking differently about how we count. So I think some of these things are not really clear even right now. I think these things are going to continue to occur as we progress. I think for me, it's really hard. The first person that I knew that passed from COVID was, at least we think it's COVID, right? I mean, this is part of the issue, was my sister's college roommate, who, very young, totally physically fine. This was, well before the vaccine. But I think the official record was that she died of a blood clot. But I think later, or her family had always suspected it was COVID. And then I think it was the same thing with with the person that I was just talking about. I think, I'm not sure what the official diagnosis was, but she was officially admitted for asthma, an asthmatic attack. And so, and I think that it's the same thing with my uncle who passed away. I think it had to, the official thing was a heart attack. And so again, I don't know when we'll know or how we'll come to know about all of these deaths or related deaths, or even this notion of what this relationship even means, right? I think that's sort of interesting. I think the other thing about the counting is the recovery part, and this really bothers me. And I'm not really sure exactly, how this is going to all play out. I think it's really fascinating as it's sort of unfolding, this notion of long COVID, or how people are talking about long COVID. And this process of, who's actually recovered, those are numbers too, right?
And we don't know.
I have no idea.
And it's funny, like I was actually I was looking back at my old text with Paul, and he was like, I don't know if I should even say this. I'll just say this about COVID. We were talking about, because he was of course an infectious diseases physician, and we were complaining about this heart condition that we both shared, and how mine was probably viral. And he was like, "Oh, fuck viruses! Like we get them. We don't know what their effects are beyond the sort of immediate symptoms." And of course, he was biased towards the bacterial and the parasitic, because you take a drug and you kill it and it's gone. The viruses, depending on which ones they are, that's not necessarily true, unless you're it's hepatitis or something like that. And so we were kind of talking about like what would recovery look like. However you choose to read that that anecdote, but we were certainly talking about what we don't know, and how to think about it. My brother had he had COVID in March 2020. And he's immunocompromised, and everyone around him got better in 2 days. My nephew didn't get COVID at all, or we don't know if he did, because they weren't letting him get tested. And my brother was sick for 6 weeks, that we know of, and it may be because of the medications that he was taking that sort of kept him from dying. But there's like a lot of, we're learning a lot, but it's fuzzy. And I think for a long time, no one wanted to admit it. I mean, think about all the other viruses that may very well be happening right now, like very circulating right now, causing similar long-term whatever. So anyway, we're medical anthropologists, so we could be talking about this all day and categories.
No, and I think, it really, I also want to say it really hit close to home. About a month ago, my older son, who's 13, who had just gotten the booster because he was allowed to get the booster, like a week right after he got the booster, started complaining about a sore throat, and my spouse wasn't looking so great either. And so we had the rapid test. This was back in the US. We had the rapid test. They took it. My son tested positive, and my spouse didn't. And so the rest of us didn't. And so we got the lab test for confirmation, and both my spouse and my son had COVID. Again, I don't know what strain it was. I have no idea. But my spouse got better after about 5 days. My son complained of, again, he was doing virtual schooling. So he was really tired a lot. He was complaining about his head being really sort of foggy, migraines, things he's never, ever complained about before. And I was starting to get really freaked out. And wondering, if we should take him in, what to do. Again, hoping, quote unquote, it would pass. Trying to keep him away from my immunocompromised parents. It was just a little nutty. And, again, I don't know. I don't know if it's stress. I don't know, we had no idea what was going on. And even coming back to Addis, the other thing was that he wasn't testing negative for travel. And so, so I was really, I think, just, really, really scared. And finally, one day he tested negative, and we were able to, he left. I was still back in the US, but my spouse took both of our kids and came back to Addis. He was still complaining about, he's been still complaining about a lot of issues, not as much, but still. But again, I don't know if it's altitude. Addis is really high. It's on high altitude.
You may never know.
I won't know. And if something pops up, it's always going to be, my God, is this a result of COVID? 2 months ago, 2 years ago, I have no idea. And so I think, for me, this is always going to be something that I think, it's been really interesting when it hits home as well. I think some of the other numbers that I'm glad they're starting to come out, and I think that I'm really, I think I really care about, are these sort of these other things in terms, one of the numbers that really sticks out at me are the number of children who've lost a parent or a guardian. That's been really something that I haven't had time to process. That's been really shocking. In terms of job losses, food insecurity, and then also I think, in terms of Ethiopia and other places, as well as the US, frankly, in terms of some of the work that I do on immigration and refugees and what the effects of this has been in terms of their security and their well-being. So I think those are some of the other things that I'm interested in terms of numbers and counting and how we sort of come to see these things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So speaking of, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing on, say, immigration and labor and health. So I guess you can talk a little bit about that, but Thurka's work has been in Eastern Shore of Maryland, which and seafood processing there. So I was sort of like, I'd actually talked to somebody who was doing like poultry processing stuff in where was it? Arkansas with the
Arkansas,
the Arkansas stuff, and I kind of kept thinking about your work a lot when I was talking to her about it. The Arkansas thing is weird because it's like it layers like all of colonial, like U.S. colonial politics. I don't know, right? With the Marshall, is it the Marshall? Are we the Marshall Islands or one of them? It's anyway.
It might be.
Yeah, but it's like Tyson has like this relationship with one of the like it's like this very bizarre thing, and like all of the workers in the poultry plant come from this series of like colonized U.S. islands, and it's like the largest pop. Anyway, but for you, I know I am always on tangents, but I kept thinking, oh my God, Thurka's work on seafood processing. I was like, well, what did that look like? What are folks in that situation processing and dealing with? No pun intended, dealing with respect to COVID.
I think the part was that I really couldn't go out there during COVID times, right? I wasn't physically being, able to sort of go there, but I did a lot of work and working with organizations that were really active in the area and really advocating for what was going on. So my work more broadly is, I had always worked on immigration, especially in my HIV work initially. But when I was at CDC, so I was at CDC, I guess I'd let that one out. I was at CDC before I came to academia. When I was there, a lot of our work was in the rural Southeast. And it was really interesting to me because I think doing disease outbreak investigations in the rural in the rural Southeast, especially around sexually transmitted infections and HIV. It was really fascinating. I had never really thought about the rural context. I was never trained in it. We don't really talk about it. And just thinking about the drastic, what was happening with healthcare infrastructure in rural areas was just really shocking to me. And it was something that I was wholly unprepared for, I think. We would go into places like Louisiana, and there'd be a sign up on a government funded, STI clinic saying we're closed, like we're closed permanently, or we're closed, come back tomorrow. So when I came to Maryland, I really wanted to really think through this sort of rural health issue, and rural context more broadly. And so I went to go work on the Eastern Shore, which is 9 counties. It's on the Delmarva Peninsula. It's a really fascinating place. It was only connected to Maryland by a bridge in the late 50s. Before that, it had been totally isolated. It's a place that depends entirely on migrant labor, but it's also very politically conservative and very highly anti-immigrant. And so it's this really it's this really interesting place, where I went to study immigration, and people told me you won't understand this unless you really understand rural health. And it took me a long time to kind of understand what they meant by that. And so it was really, I think, helpful for me to actually personally firsthand, to become sort of a witness to what had been going on in rural health for decades now in the US, in terms of just the loss of resources, the corporatization of rural healthcare, and just, continued issues. And, so you and I wrote this piece on imagining rural immunity, which
Right.
I just looked at it, and looking at those numbers, it was so early on in the epidemic. And it's really fascinating how we predicted what eventually did happen. And what's happening right now is that I think at that time when we wrote it, there were barely any cases.
There weren't that many. And in fact, Donald Trump was like, look at the rural places. Isn't it amazing? These are where our good white people live. And we were like, oh my God.
It was, it's this sort of pristine, and we talk about that imaginary, right, of the rural as this pristine, where the viruses are really coming, metaphorically and, symbolically from, from the urban sort of infecting the rural. And it's amazing, I think it was the University of Iowa that just did a report where there are more deaths in rural areas. There are more cases in rural areas. It's definitely, shifted. And I think we sort of predicted that. And unfortunately, I think, the only thing that I can say is that some of that is about, I think that some of that discourse coming from academia and from politicians is that there's more vaccine hesitancy, right? We're going back to sort of these individual sort of behaviors, and really moving away from what you and I talked about, and what hopefully other people sort of know, is that it's really about how we've left rural health systems behind, and this complete dismantling of health systems in these places, that make it really difficult for people to, and other things as well. But so this was something that I was really thinking about in terms of these numbers, and we're talking about numbers, how much that's really shifted since we wrote that article, which was less than 2 years ago.
And you know what, I actually went back to look at it too. First of all, I want to point out that anthropology is therefore a predictive science. Second of all, that someone said that, I think it was Andy Lakoff who said that to me, and we just sort of chuckled about it. Like, yes, it's true. Look at us. You don't need any models. But we also talked about we talked about reservations. We talked about prisons. Mm-hmm. And how those economies are sustained by all of these sort of exploitative, extractive, oppressive kind of like spatial formations, which I think is what a lot of your work is kind of moving towards, especially when you're talking about like rural healthcare, rural labor, and the health consequences of that. So, that's sort of like, I remember thinking, because I'm also trying to write about this with Ebola, like how to think about these conceptualizations of space that emerge out of like these sort of imperial and capitalist formations.
Yeah.
So, like, so one thing I want to say is I have, because I've read various versions of your work on the seafood processing stuff, I know a little bit more about, I feel like I know quite a bit more about what the conditions are like there. So I'm wondering if you could do, not to like really push the issue, but a little bit, I guess, speculation about, even though you weren't there, it was more difficult to get there during COVID, some speculation about some of the conditions that would make it, I mean, I guess that would shape risk, or that would shape the potential for getting care and all of those things. Do you have some hint or idea about that?
No, and I think this is, so I think, I think in that article also, we really discussed well sort of the conditions that are particular to, certain communities, right? Rural areas are very much propped up by prison economies, indigenous reservations, a lot of migrant labor, and these are invariably, as well as, multitudes of African-American communities in these areas as well. And so you have situations where, at least for the folks that I work with, I can talk about them very quickly and then sort of expand to rural areas more broadly. So in terms of, we think of rural areas as this, again, what you talked about spatially, right, in a particular way. But I think people's mobility is really limited in many ways. Oftentimes you have folks who are housed together. There's there's very little sort of social distancing, just because of economic or other kinds of needs, labor needs, right? Let's say seafood workers, they're housed in dormitories or houses where they're sharing very small spaces. You have situations where they're working in really tight quarters, very much close to each other. You have situations where masking may not be feasible, especially because, even in seafood processing, for instance, you get a lot of cuts, right? Your fingers, things like that. So even those sort of things, wearing protective things are really, the onus is on the worker to buy those things, and those are really expensive. So, even in terms of masking and things like that, I don't think that people were giving out masks or anything like that. The other thing about migrant workers is the travel. They're traveling in buses, very long distances to get to places like Maryland, right? And they're being housed along those routes in these tight quarters as well. And so you have a lot of things that are happening that make it almost impossible for people to follow these kinds of preventive measures that we know to work well, in terms of hand washing, in terms, ventilation, right?
Right.
There's very little of any of that going on in these places, and they're even in farm work where you're really outside, it's really not safe. Because ultimately you're working as well as living in very close quarters. So these are some of the conditions that I think that people are living with. And I know that things are really complex for migrant workers, but this isn't very different from how a lot of people work in rural areas, right? And I think that's something that should be stated as well.
Right.
That this is a condition of many people who live in rural areas.
Yeah. No, you actually had me thinking when you said other, people who are not migrants. So, so I know that part of my family is rural. Like, my mom grew up in a town
Yep.
that has a street named after her grandfather. It's like, and it's a dirt road. And so, I didn't know until I was, back home for a while that one of my aunts died from COVID, because there was a sense amongst the family, oh, we're all family, so we can have a massive gathering. And this was before immunizations were available. And, I kept kind of, every time I have a rural health system, like discussion, I always think about like, what would I have done living in that town of Britain's Neck that has a few hundred people in it, and like how all of my cousins who lived there, the schools had 12 people per class.
Yes.
You had to get work, you had to get on this bus that took you into the main town, if you didn't have a car, which was true for the 15 or 16-year-old who was trying to get work. And if you had cancer, if you had any kind of sort of chronic condition, how do you manage it? You're always taking your weekly trip to the next big town, which is 30, 40 minutes away. And so a lot, and that is in fact how, my mom's siblings who retired there always had to think about their health decisions were always based upon having to seek care from very far away. It's why the women from my grandmother's church used to all have to visit people, right? Like, so because we were filling in the space that had been left behind by the sort of, I guess, crumbling and receding health infrastructure. We could talk about segregation and all of that stuff and how that affected it as well. But what happens when desegregation is sort of compelled and say Black doctors are no longer sitting in the community. So there are a bunch of different things that sort of gave rise to the sort of bad health conditions. It's, gosh, now I feel like I have to go back. Like, maybe we should write something else about this. The geographer Ariana Planey actually was also writing, she was doing some quantitative work mapping this out and looking at, sort of not just the distances to health facilities, but the distances people travel for work. One of the things that I think that I had hoped was coming out of this epidemic, if there was to be anything good, is that we would start to understand that many of the questions and problems that we have about contagion and infection are actually about labor. Like when people are having these conversations about whether kids in school should be masked, I'm like, but teachers are going to work. Staff are going to work. And the second you sort of recognize that most of the places that people are existing in outside of the home are work, or sometimes their home is work now, that's when you start to have a very different kind of, I guess, mentality. I hate to use that word, about what is possible and what can be done. Which, we're in a, I was going to ask you about contact tracing. We have I know. Well, we had this sort of fantasy.
I would love to, like I said, I know we thought about writing about this, but because both of us have actually done contact tracing. Right. And I think this is, this is really, I just, all I want to say, if we have limited time, all I want to say is that I hope people understand that contact tracing is actually surveillance. So that's all I want to say. But anyway.
We will probably have that conversation at some other point. One of the reasons I brought it up, though, is we had been in a situation where, I guess we were very early in the epidemic. People were sort of like, do we do contact tracing for something like this? Right. Can we do contact tracing for something like this? I think the answer actually might be no at this point. But we one of the things that I had been struggling with, I think we both were kind of wanting to talk about, was not only is it surveillance, but it is policing. And policing. And there were moments where some of our public health talking heads wanted to be like, no, contact tracing and policing are different. And we were like, nah. There's so many ways that relationship works together, especially when you're talking about, say, STIs, which is what you were doing your contact tracing on, it's where it comes from, like those syphilis, like the partner notification. As I've been watching Lovesick again, rewatching Lovesick, or some British people might know it as scrotal recall. But that the whole show's premise is this guy gets chlamydia and he spends like the next 3 seasons or the first 2 seasons notifying his partner. And so it takes off that fun surveillance side and turns it into basically meet cute rom-com. But it's sort of it's interesting to think about, like, all those times that they sort of meet up in the STI clinic or whatever.
And I think, again, I think if we were going to write about this, hopefully we will at some point. But like, I think what's sort of fascinating is the growth of, I guess, what is it called? These tracing apps, or become digital, right?
Surveillance,
And I think that is something that I was not really, fully prepared to sort of think through. I mean, it makes sense, right? When you think about policing, it makes sense. And it makes even more sense in that sense, in that way. But I think it's really fascinating to think through this. In terms of it being sort of more digital now. So again, it's not just something to think about.
We'll put it on our list of things to do.
Yeah.
Because it's actually, what I find really fascinating is the prison abolitionists really picked up on it in a really
Exactly.
a really good way. And that's been sort of a little bit of solace for me, but it makes me wonder too, like what we can actually do and think about with respect to that. So, as you know, I have this, I have all these obligations. I'm so, this is like, when we planned this call, things were looking a bit different in terms of time. We have a couple of minutes left in the show. I just want to, I think what we came out of this with is a list of writing to do. But
I know.
Which is always fun.
Maybe Scott will let us do a series of podcasts. I don't know.
That's really fun. To be continued. But what I wanted to do in this last minute is to ask you if you had like one thing, because that was actually, I almost feel like the zing, we should end with the zing, which is, by the way, contact tracing is surveillance. But if you have one parting thought that you'd like to kind of to share, if not, we can also just sort of like, run. But I wanted to give you that opportunity for that last word.
I just, I think it's just really amazing. I kind of go back to my students in some ways on this. I think it's important. I wish we would just sort of admit what we don't know. I really wish we would. And just sort of take it from there. Instead of trying to kind of think about what we do know. I wish we would sort of embrace what we don't know. And I think that's perfectly okay. And I think it's important to do that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I agree. I say I agree. That's clear. I agree. And I'm happy to be like, I don't know quite a bit now. And I wish I actually do. Like, how can we effectively communicate our uncertainty? I think it goes a long way in terms of fostering, engendering trust. I mean, I think that's what it boils down to. All right. Thank you so much, Thurka, for your wonderful insights and and analysis. And I'm hoping that we can see each other again really soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this has been, I didn't even take a break to actually say this has been COVID calls, and there are all these places that you could be watching. But I'm doing it now. And I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.